Hello, my name's Paul Kerswill and I'm a professor here at the University of York Department of Language and Linguistic Science, and my specialism is sociolinguistics, particularly youth language, dialect contact, things like that. So what I want to try and do is to cover just some of the things in outline on the origins of Multicultural London English. You've probably come across the term Multicultural London English, and if you're in London, you'll undoubtedly have heard it on the streets and in your classrooms, I expect too. If you're not in London, you will have heard local versions of it in cities like Birmingham and Manchester, those two in particular, and also in the grime and drill music that many young people engage with. So, where did Multicultural London English come from in the first place? Has it always been there, but we didn't notice? Did it appear all of a sudden, or did it gradually edge its way into our consciousness? And what is it anyway? Is it just a fashion, or is it a thing? Is it something that we as linguists can describe and talk about? And what about the name Multicultural London English? Well, in my talk on Friday, I'm going to try to answer some of these questions and more besides. But before I do, let's see if I can answer the question of what Multicultural London English, or MLE, actually is. To do that, I'm going to give you a definition which was used in a recent online questionnaire study. And here goes. MLE is used to describe the speech of young people in multi-ethnic areas of London, regardless of the speaker's own ethnic background and their gender. A lot of young Londoners now use MLE instead of the Cockney dialect that's traditionally associated with London. So it's obviously a consequence of the multilingualism that followed the large-scale immigration that came after the end of the Second World War, essentially starting with the Empire Windrush coming over from Jamaica with about 400 Caribbean people arriving to take up new job opportunities. So we have a sort of start time, 1948, essentially. So I'm going to be taking on a linguistic journey from those initial arrivals, most of whom spoke one of several creoles or patois, with a vocabulary that's largely English-based, through to the English of the highly multilingual London of today, where over 300 languages are now spoken, and where around 40% of secondary school children don't speak English as a first language, although they're very competent in English by and large. So I'm talking mostly about young people's language, youth language, if you like, and I'll be tracing the gradual transformation of that youth language through the decades of the second half of the 20th century, as patterns of immigration changed radically during that period, and as new generations of people were acquiring English. A more general question is, how does a language change when it's in contact with other languages, to the extent that English in London has been over many centuries? It's not just a 20th century thing. In the case of London, you've got parents who were adult immigrants themselves, who are not first language speakers of English, or who indeed may not speak any English at all, at least to begin with. These adult immigrants form one of the models for the upcoming generation of English-born children and adolescents. So what's the English of those children like? Is it affected by the fact that the older generation, many of the older generation, were not first language English speakers? Are there linguistic features in the way they speak that somehow betray their origins, if you like? So one thing we can be certain of is that this new variety of English is a well-formed form of English, a new dialect, if you like. It may have pronunciation features and maybe some grammatical features and maybe also some characteristic vocabulary, including slang. But it's a homegrown, fully fledged variety of English, and as such, slots into the landscape of accents and dialects that we're familiar with. And of course, it takes on many of the features of those accents and dialects. So it's not exceptional in that sense. One thing that's often said about MLE is that it's a kind of Jamaican or Jafaican, as it's sometimes nicknamed, at least in the media. I'll be asking why that perception persists, when in fact Jamaican descended people form a relatively small proportion today of the ethnic minority population. Is it to do with the fact that the Jamaicans were the first to arrive? Okay, this is one of the questions we'll be looking at on Friday. We'll be looking at what preceded MLE, starting with the immediate post-Windrush generation, when, of course, there was the Cockney dialect and accent, which was spoken throughout London, and then the incoming Caribbean Creoles. After that, it appears that there was a kind of multiracial youth vernacular, youth Cockney, if you like, which combined a number of Creole features with what was mostly Cockney. It was used by both white and black young people, but mainly only as a kind of inter-ethnic way of speaking. It wasn't anybody's actual dialect, shall we say. But after that, around about the 1970s, young Caribbean people began to adopt what's essentially Jamaican Creole, regardless of where in the Caribbean their families came from, whether it was Trinidad or Guyana or anywhere else. They did this as a kind of resistance identity. It was a way of protesting against the racism and lack of opportunities that they were encountering in the 1970s. In the course of time, immigration from the Caribbean dropped considerably from the 1970s, while immigration from India and Pakistan, including what would become Bangladesh, rapidly increased, as did immigration from West Africa and East Africa, as well as many other parts of the world. So you end up with a very multilingual environment, not just composed of a few languages, but a very large number of languages. And no one language, apart from English, of course, is actually in the ascendancy here. It was in this environment that MLE emerged, distinct from any of the accents or dialects that came before. So not like Jamaican Creole, not like the multiracial Cockney. And not only is it distinct, but it's also, to a large extent, shared across all ethnicities and language backgrounds in London, including the white British group. But it still retains a few features, it seems, from the Windrush generation. One that springs to mind is pronunciation arcs for ask, as well as a whole lot of youth slang. As you'll see on Friday, we've developed some materials that can take us through the pronunciation of MLE, as well as its grammar. And we'll listen to a speaker who grew up in London before MLE had come on the scene, but who's able to switch to Jamaican Creole in a way that young people with Caribbean backgrounds today generally can't do. And as for the name Multicultural London English, I'll tell you a little bit about that on Friday. I'm looking forward to meeting you all on Friday.